It's a blessing in a lot of ways to be a part of a church plant, because one thing you never hear is those 7 words that kill the church. We've never done it that way before. And I think one of the things that kills churches today faster than anything is the allegiance to traditions more than the allegiance to the gospel and the allegiance to Christ. And so in the new church, you haven't established a lot of those strong traditions that people latch on to. And so they're willing to, well, okay, we'll put the ropes down, or whatever like that. They're willing to make those changes, understanding that those are not the primary issues that we're here for. That's not what we're about as a church. That's the thing that makes transitioning easier, is to hold forth what's important and to push aside the things that are not important.
Welcome to Let's Talk About That, the podcast where we dive into conversations about life and share stories of faith. We're thrilled to be on this journey with you. Whether you're a longtime listener, someone who calls the Orchard home, or you're just stopping by, Let's Talk About That is your space to explore, reflect, and connect. Join us as we navigate the intricacies of faith, spiritual formation, and daily life as we invite guests to share their stories with us. So grab a cup of coffee, find a comfortable space, and let's do this together. This is Let's Talk About That, where you can be encouraged and inspired by God's work in our lives.
Well, we are back today for part 2 of our conversation with Ken and Matt Weaver. But if you're listening to this and it's like, I don't remember part 1, that wasn't last week. No, it wasn't last week. Part 1 aired a couple of weeks ago when we heard the story of the beginning of Life Spring Church that Ken founded in Stark, Florida, and that Matt is now the lead pastor at. It was a good conversation. One of my favorite parts of the conversation is, Ken, as you described, starting Life Spring to reach people that looked like the people who worked for you at your restaurant, the steakhouse, and different kind of people, different kind of life, not church people, so to speak. And that was exciting. That's a good part of the story. Talked about the relationship with the Orchard, and we kind of ended with Matt transitioning into the role of lead pastor. And if you heard that episode, in many ways, Matt was not the top candidate for this position. Matt, have you had a chance to think about that, process that, anymore since our last conversation?
No, I've been processing that for about 4 or 5 years now.
But it was a cool story to see, that affirmed in Matt's life when God had, really put a desire and a calling on Matt to say, hey, you're going to be coming back home at some point, and just not sure what that looks like. And then, God's timing always works out. So for today's conversation, it's the 4 of us again. We've got Ken, Matt, Eddie, and myself. And what we're going to do is talk a little bit about that transition, because you guys have a unique transition at LifeSpring in that this is a father and son transitioning the role of founding pastor, or founding pastor to lead pastor. But Eddie and I also have a similar story in the fact that we transitioned here at the Orchard as well. What, a year, 2 years before you guys made the transition? Is that about right?
Yeah, because we came in that summer and talked with you guys, and I think y'all were
maybe we were in the middle of it. Yeah,
it was pretty recent after. Yeah.
So we kind of have a similar story in the fact that Eddie is the founding pastor of the Orchard, and then I came in. So Matt, you and I are the next guys, right? Like, we're the next guy, and that's an intimidating role to be in, right? So what we're going to do today in the conversation is talk about that and kind of walk through that journey, and I think it'll be a good time. So why don't we go back and just rewind for a second, and Ken, maybe share for us when you started realizing it's time for me to step back and bring somebody else in.
Well, I think the Lord had told me in my heart when we started the process of LifeSpring Church that I would not be there that long. And in my mind, I thought God's called me to start this, but not to finish it, but to open up the door for the church to go long term. And so in my mind, talking about my wife Gail and I, we would be there for 5, 6 years, 7 years tops, and at that time, it'd be time to transition. And so we were there full time for not full time, but as the only ones for 11 years when Matt joined us. And I just knew a couple of years before that, okay, Lord, you told me this earlier, and I just had that sense in my spirit that it was time to begin the process of passing on. And I did not want to just dump the ball in someone's lap. And knowing what you guys had done, I really wanted to get some input and wisdom from you guys, and y'all were a great help and encouragement to us, which I want to pause right here for just a moment and reflect back on last week, because I was accused last week of being the man with all the low ball trying to...
No, not low ball. That was just a ton of respect. I think I said coming off the top rope, I think is what I said.
Yeah. So I just wanted to...
Is this your way of pointing out that Eddie is transitioned before you and calling him old again? Because
I think he's coming from the back. I think he's coming back door this time.
Okay, is that what it is?
No, absolutely not. I just wanted to say that I was thinking about this, that this guy across from me, Eddie right here, I have great admiration and respect for him. That he has been such an encourager, gave such a great example of not only being a pastor, but going through this process in a godly fashion, and of what he's done here at Orchard and with you coming on. All those little jabs last week that you accused me of were really expressions of admiration.
Oh, I get that. And people who listen to the podcast get that too. That's, we feel that, poking each other is a love language here at the Orchard. It happens often.
Yeah, no, and I love this man. I really appreciate him.
But let's pause for a minute, because you said, Ken, you wanted to do things differently and wanted, to kind of hear what Eddie was doing because you'd seen what he and I were going through. So let's then transition over to Eddie. Now, you have been pastor of churches before you came to the Orchard, obviously. But this time, transitioning out of that lead pastor role was different. Why don't you tell us what you'd seen happen in the past? What does that look like in the past, and why you wanted to do that differently here?
Okay, great question. So as Ken was talking, the first thought that came to my mind is my ideas about transitioning were from a different perspective, because unlike Ken, I really didn't think, well, I'll just be here a few years and then I'll pass it off. In fact, that's one of the things, the marks against church planting. When I first started thinking about planting a church, and I talked to some church planters, and I talked to NAM, the North American Mission Board, and others about church planting. And I said, the one thing I don't like about me, or don't see me being a church planter, is I'm not the kind of guy that comes into a place for a couple of years, gets it established, and then hands it off to somebody. I wanted it to be, and wisely, they said to me, well, you know what? You don't have to do that. Maybe you plant a church that is a church planting church. And that really fed the idea. That was the seed that got the idea for an Orchard type church. So I was excited about maybe serving 20 years here, 25 years, whatever. And so mine was thinking long term. But as I watched how God used this church and how our emphasis was unapologetically toward young families, I began to realize that at some point I would need to find someone with similar vision and someone younger. And let's face it, back to the old card again. Once you hit into your 60s, I'm sorry, or at least for me, let me just say me. For me, my vision kind of shortened, Ken. I don't know if that happened to you, but my vision just kind of shortened, because you realize I may not be here for 20 years, 25 years, whatever. And so I knew it was time. Now, what I think Chip was asking about particularly is in my particular denomination and the way that our tradition was, basically, if you felt God leading you someplace else, you just kind of, okay, well, we pray about it. Where does he lead us? And then we resign from the church and we move on to the next location. And in doing that, I saw some flaws in that plan. And I don't mean to be critical, but I want to criticize in a positive sense. I want to critique it. I feel like that sometimes we then leave the church in a very odd position.
Yeah.
In a position that they're not equipped for and not ready to handle. And so often then the transition becomes very awkward for the guy leaving and the guy coming.
Well, I think that, Eddie, you mentioned something that is not something we can just leave out of this conversation. And Ken, it seemed like you were agreeing with Eddie there, is that a big part of this transition was sparked by vision. You said, as you got older, your vision got shorter. What do you mean by that? I know what you mean, but why don't you tell everyone else what you mean by that?
Well, I think, I want to call it vision. Maybe it's energy. I don't know. But your vision, you're concentrating, if you're not careful, or at least I began to seem to focus more on short-term things. What's the short term? What's the short-term need here? What's the short-term need here? Rather than a long-term need, rather than what does this look like in 5 years? And by the way, there was a time in my ministry when we were encouraged to have a 25-year plan. Now if you have a 5-year plan, that's a long ways out.
Yeah, 25 seems hefty.
Well, COVID, of course, moved that along. But so I think the thing is, I would tend to want to solve small or short-term issues rather than looking long-term. And sometimes, too, as we get older, we get a little more comfortable with things the way they are, and I've never been comfortable with things the way they are. Some people, Chip, might have been offended. Some pastors might have been offended when you said lately that the orchard needed to grow up. And I'm like, he looked at me kind of tenderly when he said that, and I said, no, he's right. I mean, what he's saying is we can't be content to stay 8 years old. We've got to grow up, and I think the vision for that began to wane.
Yeah. So Ken, would you kind of affirm some of that you knew that you did not have the long-term vision that was needed to continue to lead the church forward there at LifeSpring?
Well, when I'd spoken, said that I felt like we would be there 5, 6, 7 years. A lot of that had to do with my age. I was 60 years old when this ball began rolling and we first got started. And much of our vision was created by the fact that in the church that we attend and other churches, there was a overwhelming majority of senior adults in those churches with a continually lessening percentage of people that were from younger generations. And so I knew that after a period of time, I would be older than 60, and I knew that my ability to relate and connect would continue to diminish. So that's my vision, was that God would have someone else to bring in that would really be able to communicate on the level of the people we were trying to reach. Yeah. And personally, I feel I have seen that transpire. Yeah. And I mean, looking at the social media aspect of it, for a while, I was doing, when we were first young, it was just a few of us, I was doing most of our social media stuff. And then finally I got booted out of the social media job because the things that I thought were relative and were good and were impactful, others were saying, nah, we need a different perspective.
Matt, was it a lot of cat videos? Is that what it?
No, that is not a cat person.
Neither am I. And I think, Ken, what I hear you saying too is that because that core vision of LifeSpring was to reach those young, more unchurched, dechurched people, that you knew you needed somebody who could keep carrying that vision forward so the vision would move.
Absolutely.
And Eddie, you said the same thing, that you needed to find somebody who shared the vision. And I think the reason that I believe that, Ken, Eddie, your transitions went well is because it was a continuity of vision from the planting of the church on. And so often in churches, when the pastor leaves and, in our, shared denominational background, then there would be the church have to form a committee and then call somebody, or even in other denominations where a overseeing board appoints a new pastor. What happens, I think, often is that there is, at best, a change of vision, or at worst, a fight for vision that winds up harming the church.
Yeah, I think you nailed that right on, because I feel like, in fact, I recall that one of the times when I was transitioning and a church was interviewing me and I was first coming on, one of the questions they asked in the interview was, what's your vision for our church? And I had to stop and I answered honestly. I said, I don't have a vision for your church. I don't even know your church. I don't know your community. I don't know your past history. And it dawned on me then, it clicked. Just what you're saying is that sometimes we bring a new vision that is not the vision of the church, or a different vision that is not the vision of the church, or the church doesn't care to ask for any vision. And so I think you're right. I think that is a big part of the problem. And I think that's why we get mismatches and those things. And so to me, transition, a critical point was finding the person who shared the vision.
So, spoiler, because you're listening to the podcast and not in the middle of it, Matt and I are now the lead pastors of our churches. So obviously, we are the guys that you guys, wow, that was a lot of guys. We are the ones that you both shoulder tapped and said, hey, I want you to pray about this. I want you to consider this. And you shared a little bit of that story last time we talked, Ken, from your perspective, and then Matt of knowing, hey, I know I'm coming back at home at some point. And then when you got the call, said, I've been waiting on this call for a while. But let's fast forward both the story of Life Spring and the Orchard past the walking through who's the guy, how do we find the guy? Because in the church plant context, you guys were able really to shoulder tap, and maybe even another conversation one day of how you discern, who that guy is that you shoulder tap. But we've been shoulder tapped, and now the reality of having to move from one leader to the other sets in. That can be intimidating. I know it was intimidating for me because, Eddie has been my mentor for a long time. He'd been my pastor. He was the founder of the Orchard. Matt, you had all of that, plus it's your dad. So what were some of your thoughts once the reality of having to transition into leadership started happening? What's going through your head at that point?
Where to begin? Yeah, a lot of things, because a little more complex than that, it being a small town, hometown too. There's that whole added layer.
Yeah, that's a good point.
We don't necessarily have to get into today, but
let's talk about that.
Well, I'll just
see what I did there. I'll see what I did there. Okay.
It's on the stickers on the thing. I think right away, my dad, the reason why I think the church was so successful right away was because everybody knew my dad. We talked about that last time, about his job in the community. Everybody kind of knew him and loved him because of the person he is. He is such a caring, generous, a true pastor, has a true pastor's heart, which not everybody that leads a church or preaches is a pastor.
Sure.
And you definitely are, and you are a much kinder, that sounds bad about myself. You're just a very serving, loving, thoughtful, caring pastor. And I think I am too, but I think it's different. It's a different type of compassion that I have than you do. And I think I was nervous, man, how's that going to come across? Obviously, I'm going to be different in how I preach or what I want to talk about and my style. And I might go a little longer, which now I get, maybe not, maybe you went longer. I'm not sure. My mom, his wife, obviously, she's the one who will remind us, hey, a few more minutes a few less minutes would be fine on a Sunday. But yeah, I think as she's in the back serving the kids and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, 100%.
But I think a lot of those differences kind of made me nervous. Man, am I going to fill his shoes the right way? But then understanding that I have to be me and not try to become like him or try to become like the other pastor that I see on YouTube and try and sound like them. And so there was a lot of that in my head.
Well, let's park there for a minute, because I think everybody who has been in any kind of leadership transition has felt that, right? That, and in both cases here, I feel like maybe it was a fit to transition as the next guy, the next leader, because of the similarities that were there. I mean, I'm remembering when I asked both of you what your flavor were, you both said vanilla, And then we had a fantastic conversation about mustard, which I still don't think was finished. But, there's a lot of similarities there. I tell the story, and I've told this to Eddie before, but when I was pastoring in Mayo before I came to the Orchard, I would get invited to come preach at other churches, do revivals, whatever. Strangely, when I came to work for Eddie, all those dried up and nobody wanted to hear from me anymore. But I would go around and it never failed. I had literally never failed. Everywhere I would go, at least one person would come up to me and say, "Do you know who you remind me of?" And I would say, who is that? And they say, "Do you know a guy named Eddie Blaylock?" And I say, "I'd never heard of him. That's new to me." And then I would tell them I'm joking, of course. But, so I think that immediately a lot of people, and we've heard it here at the Orchard, see a lot of similarities, between Eddie and I. And that's what in some ways maybe initiates that transition. Yeah. But immediately, or at least if not immediately, very quickly in the transition, you start to realize, there's similarities, but there's differences.
Yeah, so if I can jump in a minute, Chip, with that, I think that is what makes it. I think, here's the thing. I think the similarities are interesting because I do think sometimes if the church is if things are being successful and the church is loving the pastor and the pastor is loving the church, then you probably need somebody similar, because how many times does somebody the exact opposite come in and then wonder why there's problems?
Well, isn't that typically what happens at churches who vote on the next pastor? Is they don't vote to find what they liked in the pastor who left, whether it's under good terms or bad terms. They don't vote to find what was working. They vote to get what they were missing.
Exactly. But here's the thing that I think
politics.
Yeah, exactly. The thing that I think made it work is that I think that when I looked at you after working with you for, a number of years, is there are similarities, yes, but the differences are what sold me on the fact that you needed to be in this position.
Well, press into that a little bit. Obviously, our specific context is the frame of reference that we have, but why did you see those differences as an important part of the transition?
So maybe if I could give you an example, it might help. I think one way that we are different is in our relational bandwidth, as you like to talk. You've pointed this out very often, so I don't mind pointing it out. And that is that I have a broader relational bandwidth. My relationships go out further, deeper, etc. Your bandwidth is much smaller.
Much smaller.
But what I see in the value in that is that's what I felt like was needed in order to take the Orchard to another level. I think, it's difficult. In fact, I think, y'all tell me if I'm wrong, but my observation, there's no science to this, but my observation seems to me that pastors who are pastoring larger situations have smaller relational bandwidths. And I think that's because they realize that you can't focus in on 100 people in a deep fashion and still get the work done that needs to be done to move forward. Does that make sense? So I think that's kind of important.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that, which is a tough thing in ministry because it's like the call of pastoring, right, is to be a person's pastor, shepherd, whatever. But at the same time, to help reach more people, you've got to be able to equip other leaders to come along and help and equip those people. And it's not necessarily church staff people, but it's people who have that gift who know how to care for others. And that is the part of leadership within the church. I think that can be challenging and depending on the context, other people don't no, you're the pastor, it's your job.
Yeah, I think that's where I admire what Chip's done. And what Chip's done is he has he pastors his team, his staff. He pastors people too. People love Chip. That's the good thing that people. Well, most people love Chip. So it's not
for the podcast audience. Trey is currently sitting at my desk while we're recording this, and he just looked at me and he was like, "That's iffy. I don't know."
I don't think that. People love Chip, and I think that's the unique thing that he has is he has the ability of having people to love him, and yet being able to focus on a smaller group to build leaders. And I think the thing is, if we're going to really impact lostness in our community, if we're going to impact lostness in our in a broader sense, we have to build leaders. And I felt like Chip had that a stronger capacity for that than I did.
Yeah, that's the biblical model you see laid out in the New Testament. That's the model of life Jesus lived too, right? Like he didn't. I mean, come on, it's so stereotypical. He had the inner three, then he had the 12, and then he helped other people, but his focus was the 12, right? Equipping them for the future so it could grow.
Yeah.
Otherwise, like it would have,
And I encourage leaders, pastors, disciple makers, coaches, whatever. Jesus had 12 that he poured his life into.
Yeah.
One was Judas.
Yeah.
If he can't, if that was his ratio, 11 out of 12, don't be discouraged. So I think the broader point here pertaining to transition, as a whole, is that idea that, the similarities maybe provide, a little oil to the gears to help things run smoothly. But the truth is, if there are no differences, did there need to be a transition? And so I think realizing some of those differences, Matt, I agree, it can be intimidating. Yeah, I'm not Eddie. I'm not the guy who can do what Eddie does the way that Eddie does it. He looks at, the relational bandwidth side. That's 100%, true. I say that, all the time with our staff. The other part is that if Eddie disagrees with you, it is going to be the most gracious, let's find some middle ground disagreement you've ever heard. If I disagree with you, you may be called a heretic and thrown out of the office. It varies, Yeah. And so,
but you say that kind of tongue in cheek, but it's true. And because
I have called somebody a heretic here on the podcast.
Yeah, you did. Yeah, you did. And he's gone, I think. But anyway,
I fired AJ. No, I'm just kidding. I did not.
No, but I think that's another difference that I saw that I think is very good and very needful. Because I think again, I really think it is the blend of likeness and difference that there's important.
Hey, can I ask a question? I know I'm not the host. I listened to something literally this weekend. I was mowing. That's the only time I really listened to other podcasts. And it was a conversation these guys were having about finishing well and the idea of transitioning. And they talked about it. I'm curious from your perspectives. They talked about, and this I think could be helpful for somebody in like listening who's at home, like, is this my season to transition, or if you're in ministry or whatever else. But they talked about the idea that they knew it was time. There's two big indicators. When either the grace has lifted, meaning that what once was easy is no longer as easy as it was, or B, the burden has lifted. And not that I don't care, but I don't have the same burden that I had day one or, even last year or whatever else. And I'm just curious if you guys would agree with that, or just what your spin-off take would be on that. The grace lifting or the burden?
I got an immediate response, but go ahead, Ken.
No, go ahead with your immediate response.
Boy, that just nailed me. I would say yes and yes.
Wow.
I mean, I feel like yes on the grace. How'd you put it? Grace.
The grace is lifted.
The grace is lifted.
It's lifted. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that that it's true that things are harder than they used to be. And for just one example, preaching. I used to love to just be able to get up and preach spontaneously. I carried very little notes. About the only notes I carried is when I used to print out an outline, how we all did with the blanks and fill in the blanks. And then I would carry notes so I didn't miss any blanks, because I would really hear it if I skipped a blank. You know how that goes.
So me in the crowd, very OCD. I need to know that. I can't think.
Yeah. So
he goes on to the next point. You skipped one.
Totally.
Absolutely. So I did have notes then, but now I find myself more dependent upon notes. I think that's one thing. I think in student ministry, used to I could go out there and bang with them on the basketball court, or throw the football around. Now I wouldn't be able to get out of bed the next day if I banged with them on the court. And so yes, that grace lifting, and even the burden. Man, I hate to even confess that because it sounds terrible, but in a sense, yes. And I think it is that sense of moving me toward a place of rest. I think that's my uneducated guess.
Eddie, I don't know if you remember, but you and I had some conversations, throughout the transition and everything. And we even, made sure we were kind of journaling a little bit, jotting down some notes. But one of the things that I remember telling Eddie is because I'd been a senior pastor for about 10 years, and then I'd been on staff here for about 7 in a staff role before we started the co-pastor to full transition. And I remember telling Eddie, I think I forgot how heavy the burden of sitting in that chair is. Wow. And it doesn't mean that I was necessarily doing anything different. I was still, I've told everybody who will listen, Eddie's one of the most open-handed, generous leaders out there. I was a part of any conversation I wanted to be a part of. Eddie, brought me in the loop on so many things and talked about them with me. But just feeling the burden of that chair, that what I would say the biblical office of pastor, I tangibly felt that. And I think you and I talked about how tangibly feeling that transition of the burden.
Yeah, I think and I'm with Eddie. I agree with both those statements. I really do. And I think those little statements are indicative of what we've already kind of talked about, that as you transition through life, your focus, your vision, your passion also transitions. Yeah. And so I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's a natural, normal thing that God brings us through different stages of life. And as we get older, you don't think this way when you're younger, say, I'll be like this forever. But something begins to happen and shift, and you're not like you were 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And so the passion is still there. Yeah. The burden is still there. I mean, but how to navigate those challenges, how to navigate that continuing daily, hourly demand, and it sounds so like being a pastor is terrible. The burden, the weight.
It's heavy is what it is.
Yeah. It is. It's heavy. Yeah. People don't understand that, but being able to navigate through that, I think has become much more challenging in the last few years for me. And lots because I just don't have, like Eddie said, the energy to face all that. It's it's not that I don't want to. It's that I don't know that I can and do it adequately the way the Lord would want it done.
So I get that. Well, Matt, let me ask you a pointed question here. Talking about differences and stepping into that role, what was one of the first decisions that you made as lead pastor that you knew would not have been the decision your dad made?
Yeah, I want to hear this.
That's a great question.
We could do something silly and small. Not that you wouldn't have made it, but they're just like, locking the back door. That was the quicker entrance that, jeopardizes kid safety for check-in areas. Like, people didn't make a big deal about it, but didn't love it. And it's just like, guys, kids, we got to care about kids' safety. We can't allow people to come in back here.
Yeah.
It's like, that's a small church mentality. And I'm not pointing at you, Dad, but just little things, putting up ropes to block the back chair. So it just encourages people to go forward.
Yeah.
That was the biggie.
That was
the back door was not a big deal.
It wasn't a big deal, but people cared about that. And even a couple weeks ago, somebody brought that up. And I was like, no, we're going to keep the door locked.
Yeah. So tell me about the rope in the back chairs.
We definitely want to hear that.
And it's so dumb. It's so small. It doesn't matter. But, oh, gosh.
Well, and it wasn't so much me, but some of our guys that were serving as ushers. Yeah. They wanted to rip off the back 3 or 4 rows and force people to
encourage people to,
which I understand.
Encourage kids.
As we
encourage.
But they, right. And that's what I would tell them. Like, so as we were growing, we had to add some more rows of chairs. But then, at that phase still, week to week, we're like, maybe half the people will show up on week, And so I was like, well, let's add ropes. It's what I was used to at prior, where I served previously. And no one ever thought anything about it, because it was just the way it was. You were just used to it.
Yeah.
And so I said, let's add some ropes here, these last few rows. That'll encourage people. If people want to sit here, move the rope. I don't care. There's no sign.
In my experience,
bodyguards,
people will move the rope if they want to sit there.
And they do it now.
Over the rope.
Yes.
So it was a big deal. And people were like, we're just going to make people feel uncomfortable. They want to sit where they want to sit. And, so I ended up just like letting it die. I was like, okay, it's not a bridge worth, I'm not worried about burning this relationship, because also, like, being still new, I wasn't trying to cause beef with people yet.
Yeah,
it wasn't that big of a leadership. It was a rope, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But then we as we continue to grow, they saw the need for that, and so we brought it back, and it's just a small thing, and
that's cool.
It's ropes. Who cares at the end of the day? But I think they've kind of gotten
which I think is, and I want to come back to some of these questions, because I have a question for Eddie as well. But I think you just hit on something that's really, really important for people to understand and leaders to understand. Number one, and maybe this is not something we press into because people know it, we just don't do it. You can't just push all your chips in on any decision that you make, right? There's some that matter. There's some that's not that big of a deal. You have to be wise about that. But the second thing is the people eventually, as the church continued to grow, realized that was the right decision, but they had not yet trusted you early on to make that decision. And so a couple of things there. Number one is, just because there's pushback on a decision doesn't mean it's a wrong decision. Number two, the lack of trust slows us down so often.
Well, one of the things that's right. I saw, and I'm not, Eddie may disagree or whatever, but when Matt would want to make some decisions like that, and I generally was good with most everything. He may disagree with that.
No, I think
but,
so, yeah.
You know, when people didn't like something that he would decide, I would hear about it before he would hear about it. And so I was trying to keep them pacified.
So how do you do that? How did you handle that when people started coming to you with, let me tell you what your son did?
Well, it really was never quite that bad, but I just tried to encourage them, to follow him, protect him, but at the same time, encourage the people that had not seen what he was wanting to do. And so it's just, you have to
Do you think that was easier or harder because Matt was your son? Like, easier to do the defend and deflect? If it had been somebody else, would you think it would have been different?
I don't really think so. I think the former pastor, current pastor, new pastor, that relationship was a priority relationship at this point in time, not the fact that he was my son. So sure, he's my son, but I can also step on him if I need to. It didn't bother me quite as much.
Honestly, I was wondering if it might not have worked the other way, in that you felt more freedom to let Matt know these things because he was your son that you might not have probably if he hadn't.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no doubt about that. But I think we both realized that, and we tried really hard to not bring the father-son into the picture that much. Just try to. He's the new pastor. I'm the transitioning out pastor, and everything I want to do is support him and what he's doing, encourage him, and help the others to see that way, regardless of whether he is my son or not.
Yeah, so that's good. So Eddie, I'm not gonna let you off the hook. I have a question for you, and I'm not sure I know the answer to it. But what's the first decision I made that made you cringe? Like, oh.
You're probably going to think I'm dodging that question, but I'm not. I really don't remember one. I think that, man, you caught me on the spot there. Let me chew on that a moment. I think I really don't think of one, honestly, Chip.
Really? Because I can think of a couple.
Well, remind me.
Well, one is when I made us have an extra meeting on Tuesday.
Oh, well, yeah, around there. I didn't know you were talking about me personal preference.
Eddie is very anti-meeting. He does not care for meetings. I'm like, you got to be in the same room to get on the same page. And so I'll throw out a meeting. And I know that made, I know Eddie is going to be kind and gracious. I know that made him cringe.
Well, yeah, but I guess I was thinking bigger. I think it was something that impacted.
Well, look, I'm not going to throw myself under the bus on a big decision. I'll do it on a less decision.
No, that impact. But yeah, you're right there. I'm not a meeting guy. I'm just the kind of guy. I'd rather be out there talking to people or dealing with people in meetings. Yeah. So, but I don't think of anything outstanding that I felt like would be a strong impact. There's a few things that I've questioned. Yeah. Let me go there. I don't know that I would say. I wasn't sure of. For example, you really just felt like you needed to get around to all the locations a little bit more on Sundays to speak. And I wasn't sure about that when you first talked about it. And one of the reasons is because that would mean you would be gone away from one of our locations more. And so I wondered about that. But as I watched that unfold, I really, and I don't know if I ever told you about that, Chip, but what I should have done is told you as I saw it unfold, that was a really good move because I would think as the lead pastor now, that may not be as important as it was then, but because of the fact that there was a transition and because of the fact that everybody thought I was the lead pastor still, that was very effective and I thought a very good move. But I did question it at the beginning in my own mind.
Okay. Yeah, I think, for me, it was important because I knew that you have built a high trust culture, here. But just because you put somebody else in that position doesn't mean that the trust automatically transfers with it.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of people at each location that did trust me, but there were a lot of people at Branford and Live Oak specifically who didn't know me. And so I thought that was important.
Yeah, and I think that was like the little things with the ropes. It's like, who cares at the end of the day? But it was, early on, there's no trust. So whether it's ropes or a big deal, right, that takes time for people to get to know you and people to get to build trust. And I was a part of a transition where we hired a new student pastor, and this was at a previous church, and the transition didn't go well. And kind of day one, he came in guns blazing with just new vision and just said some things at at one of his very first leader meetings with all of our small group leaders and stuff. And it was a 180 degree turn right away. And it just stepped on a lot of toes. And you know what? He was probably right about 90% of the stuff and everything else was awesome. But he did it way too early and had no trust. And so it did not go over well. And so I think it was kind of one of those scarring moments for me. Like, I'll never forget this because I was a part of it as one of his leaders. And I was just like, I don't ever want to come in like kicking the door down on my way in. Like, here's the new sheriff's in town. And thankfully, kind of going through we went through, it was a full year of co-pastoring, but I think technically it was like around the 6th or 7th month mark. Sometime like in August that year was whenever we like switched roles, even though you stayed on and still did things. And so there was a lot of time built in, different than you guys. You were on staff even more, right? People knew me. I'd come in and preach once or twice, maybe over the last several years before. But yeah, it takes time to build trust. And so it's a big deal when you're a new leader or new at work or whatever else, right? Like, and that's okay. It takes time.
Yeah, I think.
Let me interject.
Go ahead.
And all this makes me think this whole transitioning process back to some of the things that I actually learned while I was in seminary so many years ago. And I can remember one of our one of our professors that was in charge of pastoral ministries classes and teaching us, and he told us, he said, when you go to a new church and you first get started, he said, you don't need to change anything for the first year.
Yeah.
He said, you need to be there and establish and develop that trust among the people. They need to know that you're real, that you're not just going to be there for a little while and then leave again. And so that's stuck with me for a long time. And in my personal experience, I've just seen that played out so many times in a bad way. I was, for years part of Southern Baptist churches, and the process, the process of Baptist churches, somebody starts to court you to come be their pastor, and so
we'd like you to come preach for us.
Yeah. So you kind of discreetly kind of say, I'm going to be gone next Sunday, and those people who really care about you and know that you they're beginning to question what's going on. So then all of a sudden you get up one Sunday and say, God's called me to another place, and 2 weeks later you're gone, and the church is left in a lurch. There is no transition. There is zero transition, and Eddie knows that has a devastating impact upon churches. So every few years they're starting all over again.
Yeah.
And that's I think a critical point of where things are not done in a fashion that is good for the health and benefit of the church. And I'll try to make this quick. A number of years ago, before I even had this passion to start LifeSpring, I had an opportunity to go through a transitional pastor training program that in Florida, the Florida Baptist Convention, together with NAM, was putting together to train men to go in and pastor churches going through transition. And they had a formula how long a church needed to have someone. And it was a great training experience. So I spent a week at a training session with about 25 or 30 other guys to prepare to do that. And after we all kind of got prepared and were ready to go out, it wasn't but just maybe 6 months later, the state dropped that program. And the reason they dropped it is because when someone would come in and start talking about, well, this is what we would encourage you to do to transition to the next guy, the churches were not willing to do what had been suggested because it involved a lot of things of helping the church see what maybe they needed to work on, to look at casting vision, doing some evaluation, self-evaluation. And so that transition was hard for that church family, so hard they weren't willing to be patient to work through that. So, and that just kind of indicated to me that for any church, transitioning from one pastor to the other is a challenging thing to do. And just to one day stand up and say, okay, guys, I'm going to retire. Matt, my son's going to come in and he's going to take over. I mean, it would have been crash and burn from the word go. And I think that's and it's not obviously it's not my decision of how that takes place on everything, but, and not my vision, but the transitioning process of passing the baton, training up new leaders, letting the church embrace you as what Eddie did, and letting our church LifeSpring embrace Matt, that has enabled the transition, I think, to be effective and successful. And and I think ours has been effective. And
successful. I mean, it looks that way. I think that, Matt, you hit on, and Ken, this is exactly what you're talking about. Like when you're that new leader, the first instinct a lot of times is to come in and say, I'm going to change this, this, and this. But that's not healthy transition. That doesn't typically go well. And so that's part of why the transition process that we've went through, I think, has worked really well. I think that, you guys followed a similar model, that we did, in the fact that you identify the leader, affirm the leader, there's a period of co-pastoring, and then you officially hand the baton off. One thing that Eddie did that I think was incredibly helpful, and that I think other churches in a similar position would do really well to copy, and it directly combats what you're talking about, Matt, coming in, kicking the door down, making changes, is I think even before we officially did the co-pastoring year, that was part of it, but I think even before that, Eddie came to me and said, okay, what are some changes that you're going to want to make early? Let me go ahead and be the one to make them so that it's ready when you take the role.
That's and that's obviously having the advantage of like you already being here on the snap.
It was a unique situation, but it was so helpful.
But that is genius. Well thought out, sir.
Yeah, the problem with it is I chickened out. But he told me to change this. Oh, no, I can't do that.
Just teasing. That was funny. But I do think it's helpful because it gives you, the ability to make some changes. But really, in Eddie's way, he would tell you, I think, that year of co-pastoring was one designed to, hey, if I went just crazy off the reservation, whatever, he could pull the reins back. But that was maybe about 10% of what co-pastoring was designed to do. 90% was, he would tell you, just to take, I'll take the bullets that are coming your way if there are any.
Yeah, you really were making most of the decisions at that point, and just kind of under my covering. And that did work out very, very well. And, I was just thinking, too, as in this conversation, Chip, and we probably don't want to go there, or no, we're running a little long, but it kind of works, this transition thing works at many levels, because we've also been able to do that with some of our location situations, where we've transitioned you to the Lake City location and Matt to the Live Oak location. And, some of the same principles have made for really smooth transitions.
Yeah, I think that is something that you got to hear in this conversation, is this isn't just talking about moving from one lead pastor to another. It is a leadership transition.
Yeah.
Anybody who's in a leadership role, you you're going to deal with transition. You don't always get to do it this way. And we've talked about that. If you're a pastor, it may be to do with your context that you're pastoring in. If you're at a job, it may be the same thing. However, I think the place that you see the opportunity for this most often outside the church world is if you get a promotion at work.
Yeah.
If somebody's coming in taking your place, usually when you get promoted, it's at least, within the same area of responsibility. So you're not leaving what you were doing behind. You're just taking a step up. You're not transferring from produce to automotive or something like that. So really taking that opportunity to transition well, even as something as I got a promotion at work, that's huge. Makes a big difference. All right. So we are running out of time. Let's kind of wind this down a little bit with this question, because there's something, or question topic. There's something a little bit different about your transitions, besides, the father and son. But it's something that Eddie shares as well. You are both, Eddie and Ken, still at the church. That's not always the case. And I'd go further to say most, if not the vast majority, at least most of the consultants that Eddie and I read or whatever during our transition said, yeah, that's a terrible idea to stay at the church after you transition. But it's worked in both cases. Any thoughts on why that is, thinking through that, anything like that?
Well, I have two thoughts. One is that transition is often more difficult for the people than it is for us, because for example, the people here at the Orchard know Eddie, loved Eddie, and so when you come aboard, they're still going to go to Eddie when they've got a special critical need. They're still going to call on him in the middle of the night, because that relationship they've had. And same thing is true with us. So that's a challenge that you have to. We don't deflect that responsibility of caring and pastoring those people. But, if I get a message about something, and somebody texts me about so-and-so's in the hospital or so-and-so's mother just died, first thing I do is I message Matt and make sure that he knows about that. And because people aren't ignoring him, but they go back to their what they're comfortable with.
Yeah.
And so
it's often not an intentional run around, just,
right.
Hey, there's a rut in this road because I've went this way so often. That's just where I'm going. I'm going to Kim.
Yeah. And the other thing is, I would just say that it's a blessing in a lot of ways to be a part of a church plant, because one thing you never hear is those 7 words that kill the church. We've never done it that way before.
Well, I would say you do. They come up quicker than you would think.
Yeah, but
quicker than we've never done ropes before. That's right. Yes, but
different.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. You get a chance to create new habits.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that kills churches today, faster than anything, is the allegiance to traditions more than the allegiance to the gospel and the allegiance to Christ. And so in the new church, you haven't established a lot of those strong traditions that people latch on to. And so they're willing to, we'll put the ropes down, or whatever like that. They're willing to make those changes, understanding that those are not the primary issues that we're here for. That's not what we're about as a church. And so I think that's a thing that makes transitioning easier, is to hold forth what's important.
Yeah.
And to push aside the things that are not important.
Yeah, it's better to walk through all of life with open hands rather than holding on to tight to things. And so one of y'all were saying something earlier, it made me think about that idea of just like any season or whatever we're going through in life, like it should always be, okay, what is Jesus calling and leading me to? Not what do I want to hold on to, whether that's continuing to lead my church or continuing in this job or continuing in this hobby or continuing in this sin that God has so clearly called me away from. When we hold on to things and God's got to rip them out of our hands, it hurts a lot more when we're going to look back, right? When we're supposed to be leaving, what happens, right? And so there is the idea of being open-handed with God. Where are you calling, leading me to? And it's much better to walk through life that way, no matter what you do for a living or profession. Something else, you were going back to your question. Yeah. I think for us, every, traditional wisdom would say, the pastor needs a balance. And there was maybe a month or two, you were pretty in and out after we had officially transitioned. But I think in our context, think about it, small town, there's 5 or 6 other, there's actually a lot of churches in Bradford, but only a few other bigger name churches, whatever. But in our context, a church plant that's started by the dad and now the son is taking over, probably be more awkward.
Yeah,
The dad stuff is going.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree. I think that's a great point.
But no, yeah, there's probably been some things, maybe you probably dealt with more of those headaches than I've realized of people still going to you about things, but it's worked out well for us, I would say. And
Yeah.
Yeah.
Eddie, any thoughts on staying?
Yeah, I was wondering if this question was going to come up. Yeah,
Because you're a little bit different. You're not just staying, you're still full-time staff.
still on staff. Yeah, exactly. Well, I want to say what I would like to say, but since my wife may listen and she knows the truth, I will say I don't think it's always easy to stay. I think I've said to her a few times, I think it would have been easier if I'd have left, if I'd have been completely retired, not necessarily left the church in the sense of going to find another church to be in. But I've often said to her, I think it would have been easier if I would have just been able to leave. But that was really more of a selfish thing than a good thing. It was not that I felt wronged or not that I didn't like what was happening necessarily. In fact, Chip, you said to me several times that I think you're worried about that way more than I'm worried about that.
Yeah.
Meaning,
Yeah.
Sometimes I overcompensate because, as Ken was saying, I don't want to do something that's going to distract from Chip being the leader because I don't want people coming to me instead of him. Sometimes I'm overprotective and overreacting that way, and that's somewhat uncomfortable. But I wholeheartedly agree with what Ken and Matt have said. I think for the people, it's a good thing to hang around a little bit because it does make that transition, and it doesn't make you the bad guy who came in and replaced the good guy.
Yeah.
It's not it at all. I mean, and fortunately, I think the reason I would be very quick to say that we've had a good succession is the fact that very few times now, like you said, Ken, at the beginning, people might come to me, but now they don't come to me. They know to go to Chip. Yeah. They know. They understand completely. And I think that tells me that succession has been successful. And having said all that, I do like what I'm doing, so I don't want you to fire me, So I like I look forward to what's next for me at the Orchard. Unlike, and Ken, I know you left other churches too, unlike churches where we came to that were already established and then we left, I had people tell me when I would come to a new church, now, Pastor, we were here when you came and we'll be here when you leave, and so those churches, it was hard to leave, but when you leave, it's just that. But with
those churches
as a church that you have planted, it's your family, it's your baby. I mean, I can't see going anyplace else, honestly. So I'm going to be here as long as they'll have me
Until we're told.
Yeah, it's funny.
You need to find it.
Yeah, no, not going anywhere. So, man, it's been a good conversation. A lot more that we could talk about, but Matt, I want to give you the last word here. If there's a guy out there listening to this, one of the dozen that listens to this, and they are getting ready to be the next guy, whether it be in a situation like ours where we've transitioned, or a more traditional type setting where they're just coming in, brand new by the vote of the church or an appointment of a board or whatever. What would you tell a guy who's getting ready to be the next guy?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing what I talked about before, don't kick the door down on the way in. Be patient, be slow. Your job is not to make all the changes and hit home runs day one. Your job is to slowly transition well, do your job and get to know the people, build the trust. It's so much of what we just talked about. Build the trust, I would say, for at least 6 months, or probably that's a good marker to begin to build enough trust to work on little things. It doesn't mean you're not dreaming for the next year or that 6 month mark of like, okay, I'm going to set priorities of here's the 5 things that I see right away, from ropes to rebrands to whatever other big things. You're dreaming, you're planning, you're prioritizing that in the back of your mind. But that's not day one goals. Like that is down the road just a little bit. Some are short-term, some are long-term goals. So definitely don't do that day one. Worry about building relationships with the people. That was something I tried to do. I definitely probably didn't do it perfectly. Was just going to get coffee or lunch with some of the key kind of leaders in the church, getting to know them on a just individual basis, just as people, as dads, as husbands, as just what they did for work, and trying to connect with them, connect with the current team and leaders. Like, hey, how's it going? What are you enjoying? What's going well? What's frustrating you? Asking those questions, like what would be some, right away changes you'd like to see made from like the staff, if you have one, or the volunteer staff. That was something I tried to do early on with our volunteer staff, was meet with them and ask them like, all right, hey, what's some things we just need to work on? Like, it's a perfect time, like in a transition, like I don't have to come in and make a change. Sometimes other people want to make a change.
That's true. That's true.
And you're buying trust by asking them that question early on. And they're like, oh, wow, this guy cares. Not that the previous guy didn't care, but he at least does care. And he's asking this question right away. And so, yeah, I think those are a couple big things: meeting with people, building trust, going slow. As soon as you started asking, I had a thought, and then I started talking about those other things, and then I forgot it. So I don't know. I think those are some really...
Well, I mean, the build trust is huge, not just taking time, but building trust. And that comes through relationship, right? Yeah. What you said, life is all about relationships. That's what, Ken said. And I think another way that you add on to building trust is, I think, look for every opportunity to honor the guy who came before you.
Yes.
Because I think not only does it give honor and do right by the person who came before you, but it builds trust with the other people. It's like, hey, any changes that we make is not out of a lack of love or respect for the person who came first. As a matter of fact, I'm not sure they wouldn't have made some of these decisions I'm making. It's not about that. It's not about I'm better, I'm here. It's just I'm in this role, so I'm going to honor that person as much as I can. And
I think that's huge.
Yeah, and I will say, saying that out loud, knowing that, Matt, we got to come into good situations. That's not always the case for everybody. And so I would say, even in those situations, look for ways where you can, with integrity, honor the guy who came before you. Don't just blow smoke. People can pick up on that quickly, but there's got to be something good that happened there, right? So look for ways that you can honor that person.
Yeah, I think that's huge.
Yeah, I think that's really important, Chip, and you've done a really good job of that. And I would say, as you have done that, what I find myself thinking is, I didn't necessarily need that, but that was really good to hear. I mean, I don't know if that makes sense, but
I wasn't looking for it, but I ain't mad at it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I heard somebody say nobody ever died from too much encouragement.
Exactly.
It's like,
I love that. That's good.
I mean, like it never hurts to appreciate and honor people.
That's good. That's good. I like that. Well, man, it's been a good conversation. Like I say, I think we could talk a lot more, but let me throw this out there. If you are specifically a pastor in transition, whether you're the new guy coming in or the guy trying to figure out what transition looks like and what's next, I'm going to say feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to be able to have those conversations with you, sit down, lunch, coffee, whatever, and figure out how we can keep you from making some of the mistakes we made and how you can learn. Because I would say, I feel like both of our transitions at LifeSpring and at the Orchard went really well. So it's good. All right, guys. Well, thanks for coming on, Weavers. It's been a 2-part episode spread out by a week, but we got you here. Now you're probably going to get stopped on your way home. You're like, oh my gosh, you're the guys who are on the podcast. It's going to be weird. But anyway, that's all we got for you this week. Hope you guys will join us next week. Until then, we'll talk to you later.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Let's Talk About That. We hope it encouraged and challenged you as we continue to grow on this journey of faith and embrace community together. If you have any questions, thoughts, or feedback, we'd love to hear from you. Reach out to us through our social media channels or visit our website to stay connected. Your support is what makes this podcast impactful. If you found today's discussion meaningful, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, share the episode with a friend, and leave a review. Your engagement helps us spread the message and connect with others who can be encouraged through these conversations. Until next time, we hope this episode inspired you to live out your faith this week. Keep the conversations alive, and remember, we're all on this journey together.